I unlocked the door to my own house, the same door I'd opened for years. And before I could even take off my shoes, my daughter-in-law looked at me and said, "Good, you're here. Grab your things and leave." At first, I honestly thought she was joking. I laughed, waiting for the punchline, but her face didn't change. I asked her what she meant. She crossed her arms and repeated it, slower this time. "This isn't your home anymore." My heart started racing. This was the house I paid for. The house where I raised my son. The house filled with my memories. I stood there, frozen, wondering how someone could say that to me, in my own home. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just listened and walked out. But what she didn't know, what she never expected, was that kicking me out would be the biggest mistake she ever made. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand who I am and what that house truly meant to me. I'm not someone who asks for much. I never was. I grew up believing that if you worked hard, kept your word, and looked after your family, things would somehow work out in the end. Life wasn't always kind, but I learned early on not to complain. You keep going. You do what needs to be done. That's how I lived my life. I spent most of my adult years working long hours at jobs that didn't come with praise or recognition. Jobs where no one clapped for you at the end of the day. I worked because I had to, because there were bills to pay and a child to raise. I raised my son mostly on my own, and every decision I made revolved around making sure he had stability, something I didn't always have growing up. That house wasn't handed to me. It wasn't inherited. It didn't come from luck or generosity. It came from years of sacrifice. I still remember the day I signed the papers. My hands were shaking, not because I was scared, but because I couldn't believe I had actually done it. A modest house, nothing fancy, but it was mine. Every payment I made felt like a small victory. Some months were harder than others. There were times I had to choose between repairing something in the house or buying myself something new. I always chose the house. That house saw everything. It saw my son take his first steps across the living room floor. It heard his laughter echo down the hallway. It was there during the quiet nights when I sat alone at the kitchen table, wondering if I was doing enough, being enough. It held birthdays, arguments, apologies, and moments of deep, tired silence after long days. Walls remember things. People don't talk about that enough. A house absorbs the life lived inside it. Every scratch on the floor had a story. Every window had been opened on warm evenings when we couldn't afford air conditioning. Every corner of that place was shaped by my effort, my love, and my persistence. So when people talk about just a house, I know they've never built a life from the ground up. As my son grew older, I tried to give him space to become his own person. I didn't want to be the kind of parent who clung too tightly. When he met his future wife, I welcomed her. I truly did. I wanted to believe that gaining a daughter-in-law meant gaining another family member, not losing my place in my son's life. At first, things seemed fine. She was polite, reserved, a bit distant maybe, but I told myself that everyone has their own way of warming up. I didn't push. I didn't pry. I respected boundaries because I wanted to be respected in return. When they started spending more time at my house, I didn't think twice. It made sense. The house had room, and I liked knowing my son was nearby. I cooked meals. I stepped back when I sensed they wanted privacy. I tried to be accommodating without being invisible. But slowly, without me even realizing it, the atmosphere began to change. Small things at first. The furniture was rearranged without asking. Items were moved from where I always kept them. Comments were made, casual ones, about how things should be done differently. I told myself it was nothing. Couples build their own rhythms. I didn't want to be in the way. Still, there was a shift, a feeling I couldn't quite name. I began to feel like I was tiptoeing in my own home, like I needed permission to exist in spaces that once felt natural to me. When I tried to talk to my son about it, he brushed it off, said I was overthinking, that it was just an adjustment period. I believed him, because believing him was easier than admitting something was wrong. The house, my house, began to feel unfamiliar. Not because the walls had changed, but because the way I was treated inside them had. I started spending more time in my room, less time in the shared spaces. I didn't want to cause tension. I didn't want to be that parent. And yet, despite all of that, I never imagined I would be told to leave. That possibility never crossed my mind, not once. Because no matter how strained things felt, no matter how uncomfortable I became, that house represented everything I had built. It was my anchor, my proof that I had survived, that I had succeeded in giving my child a stable foundation. Which is why, when I stood in that doorway and heard those words, it felt like more than rejection. It felt like the erasure. She wasn't just telling me to leave a building. She was telling me that my life, my sacrifices, my presence didn't matter anymore. And in that moment, as I stood there, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong, I realized something painful. I hadn't just lost control of my home. I had lost control of my own story. Or so I thought. My son wasn't always quiet. When he was younger, he used to talk about everything. School, friends, ideas that didn't make sense yet, but mattered to him all the same. He was curious, kind, and stubborn in a gentle way. The kind of child who felt deeply, but didn't always know how to express it. I learned to listen between his words. As he grew older, that openness softened into independence. I respected that. I didn't want to hold him back or make him feel responsible for my happiness. I'd already given him enough weight to carry, just by being a single parent. So when he met her, I told myself this was simply the next chapter of his life. I remember the first time he brought her home. She was polite, well-spoken, and carefully composed. She smiled at the right moments, thanked me for dinner, and complimented the house in a way that felt rehearsed. Not fake, just measured. I thought maybe she was nervous. Meeting a partner's parent can do that to anyone. I welcomed her the way I knew how. I made sure the house was clean. I cooked more than necessary. I asked questions without pushing too far. I wanted her to feel comfortable, not examined. At first, my son seemed happy, lighter even. He laughed more when she was around. I took that as a good sign. Love should make life feel bigger, not smaller. But slowly, I noticed changes, not dramatic ones. The kind you only recognize after they've been happening for a while. My son began checking his phone more during conversations. He grew quieter at the dinner table. When I asked him simple questions, He'd glance toward her before answering, as if measuring his response. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. She, on the other hand, grew more confident, not in a loud way, in a quiet, controlling one. She had opinions about everything: how the kitchen should be organized, how often lights should be turned off, how conversations should be timed. She didn't demand change. She suggested it, repeatedly, until it became normal. I told myself she was just particular. Everyone has habits. I didn't want to label her unfairly, so I adjusted. I moved things. I stayed quiet. I chose peace over pride. There were moments when I felt invisible, but I brushed them aside. Families change. Roles shift. I didn't want to compete for space in my own son's life. As time passed, they started staying over more frequently. Eventually, it felt like they had simply moved in. It happened so gradually that there was never a clear moment to object. I told myself it made sense. Why pay rent when there was room here? I wanted to be helpful, supportive. That was my first mistake, because once they settled in, the balance shifted completely. She began making decisions without consulting me, small ones at first, then bigger ones. Guests were invited without notice. Plans were made that involved the house as if it belonged to them. When I tried to speak up, she'd smile politely and say, "We thought it would be easier this way." My son stopped meeting my eyes when these conversations happened. I started to feel like a guest in my own home, like someone passing through a space that no longer belonged to them. I told myself it was temporary, that once they saved enough, they'd move out, start their own life elsewhere. But that conversation never came. Instead, the tone shifted again. She began correcting me. Not openly, never directly, just small remarks. "That's not how we usually do it." Or, "Maybe it's better if you don't get involved." Each comment landed softly, but they stacked up. I tried talking to my son one evening when she wasn't around. I told him I felt uncomfortable, that I felt pushed aside. He listened, but his responses were vague. He said things like, "She doesn't mean it that way," and "You're reading too much into it." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The son I raised had always been thoughtful. He'd always spoken up when something didn't feel fair. Now, he avoided conflict at all costs, especially when it involved her. It wasn't that he chose her over me. It was that he chose silence. And silence, I learned, can be just as painful. There were moments when I thought about asserting myself more firmly, reminding them whose house this was. But every time I considered it, I worried about pushing my son away completely. I told myself that love meant patience, that if I just endured a little longer, things would settle. Instead, they escalated. She grew bolder, more assured, as if she had already won something I didn't realize was being contested. The house, the authority, the narrative. And I, without realizing it, had stepped out of the story. By the time the confrontation came, the groundwork had already been laid. I had been slowly erased from decisions, from conversations, from my own space. So when she finally spoke those words that day, they didn't come out of nowhere. They were the final sentence in a story that had been quietly rewritten right in front of me. I just hadn't known how to stop it. Not yet. Control doesn't arrive all at once. If it did, you'd recognize it immediately and push back. It comes quietly, wrapped in reason, disguised as help. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're already living by someone else's rules. That's how it happened with her. At first, she framed everything as concern. Concern for the household. Concern for my son. Concern for what was best for everyone. She spoke calmly, confidently, as if every suggestion came from logic rather than preference. She started with routines. Meals were suddenly scheduled. If I ate earlier or later, I'd get a look. Not a comment, just a look. Lights were turned off behind me. Windows were opened or closed without asking. My way of doing things was never directly criticized, but it was constantly adjusted. When I noticed, she'd smile and say, "I just like things organized," as if organization and control were the same thing. Then came the boundaries. Hers, not mine. She began deciding which rooms were shared and which were private. The living room became theirs. The kitchen became a place where I felt like I was in the way. My belongings were moved. Sometimes without explanation. When I asked where something was, she'd say, "Oh, I put it somewhere safer." Safer for whom, I wondered. I began shrinking my presence without meaning to. I'd wait to use the kitchen until I knew they were done. I'd keep my door closed more often. I stopped inviting friends over, worried it might disrupt the household. No one asked me to do these things. I just learned, slowly, that peace came from being invisible. Money was the next thing she touched. Not openly. Not aggressively. Just enough to shift control. She'd talk about bills in general terms, suggesting they should be managed better. She'd mention how expensive things were, how everyone needed to contribute. I paid for the house. I always had. But she spoke as if responsibility was shared now, without ever asking. When repairs were needed, she took over the decisions. Who to call, what to fix, what could wait. I was informed after the fact, not consulted. My house had become a project I no longer led. My son stood by during all of this. He didn't agree with her openly, but he didn't challenge her either. Whenever I tried to bring something up, she'd respond quickly, confidently, leaving no space for him to step in. And he didn't. Silence became his habit. I started questioning myself. Was I being too sensitive? Was this just how families worked when children grew up? Was I clinging to control I was supposed to let go of? Those questions haunted me because they kept me from trusting my instincts. The more control she gained, the more confident she became. She spoke for both of them. Decisions were made as a unit. Without me, plans were announced, not discussed. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone, referring to the house as ours. I froze, not because of the word itself, but because of how naturally it came to her. As if ownership had already shifted in her mind. As if I was already written out. When I mentioned it later, casually, she laughed. Oh, you know what I meant. But I did know what she meant, and it scared me. She began setting rules that applied only to me. Noise levels, guests, timing. If I questioned anything, she'd sigh and say, "We're just trying to create a healthy environment." Healthy for whom? I noticed I was apologizing more for things that didn't require apologies, for existing, for taking up space. Each apology made it easier for her to push further. And she did. She'd correct me in front of my son. She'd rephrase my words as if I hadn't said them properly. She'd make decisions and present them as final. And every time I looked to my son for support, he'd look away. That hurt more than her behavior ever could. Because I realized then that I wasn't just losing control of my house. I was losing my place in my own family. The worst part wasn't the rules or the rearrangements or the constant discomfort. It was the feeling that I no longer had authority anywhere, not even over my own life. I felt like a guest waiting for permission to breathe. And yet, despite all of this, I still didn't believe she would cross that final line. I thought there were limits, that respect, at the very least, would remain, that no matter how uncomfortable things became, I would never be asked to leave the home I built. I was wrong. By the time she told me to pack my things, the decision had already been made long before that day. The control was complete. The narrative was set. She wasn't kicking me out in the heat of the moment. She was executing a plan. And the most painful part, I had helped her do it by staying silent. That morning started like any other. There was nothing in the air to warn me. No raised voices, no tension thick enough to feel. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into a house when people are awake but not speaking. I remember noticing how clean everything looked. Too clean. The living room felt staged, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. I had stepped out earlier to run a few errands. Just normal things. Groceries. A quick stop at the pharmacy. I remember thinking about dinner, about whether I should cook or just heat something simple. Ordinary thoughts. Safe thoughts. When I came back, I unlocked the door like I always had. Before I could even set my bag down, she appeared in the hallway. She didn't greet me. She didn't smile. She looked prepared. "Good," she said. "You're here." I paused. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "We need to talk." I waited. She didn't ask me to sit. She didn't lower her voice. She just stood there, arms crossed, blocking the path to the rest of the house. "You should grab your things," she said, "and leave." For a moment, I didn't understand the words. I heard them, but they didn't connect. They floated in the air between us, unreal. "I'm sorry," I said. She sighed, as if I were the one making this difficult. "This arrangement isn't working anymore," she continued. "We've talked about it, and we've decided it's best if you move out." We. That word landed harder than anything else. I looked past her, down the hallway, toward my son's room. Is he here? I asked. She didn't turn around. He's busy. Busy. I asked her what she meant, how long I had, where I was supposed to go. She tilted her head slightly, not unkindly, not kindly either. I think it would be easier if you just take what you need for now, she said. We can talk about the rest later. The rest. As if my life could be broken down into categories. I felt something crack inside me then. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, a deep, hollow disbelief. I reminded her that this was my house, that I had paid for it, that I had lived there long before she ever entered my son's life. She nodded slowly, the way people do when they're pretending to listen. Yes, she said, but things change. That was it. No discussion, no hesitation. Just a final statement, delivered with confidence. I raised my voice then, not shouting, just louder than before. I told her she had no right, that she couldn't make this decision alone. She didn't argue. She simply said, I'm not doing this alone. And in that moment, my son appeared. He stood behind her, silent, avoiding my eyes. I looked at him and waited for him to speak, to say something, anything. He didn't. That silence was louder than her words. I asked him if this was what he wanted, if he was really asking me to leave. He swallowed, shifted his weight. I think it's best, he said quietly. Best. That word shattered whatever was left of me. I felt suddenly very old, very tired, as if all the years I had spent holding everything together had caught up with me at once. I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind him of everything, of the sacrifices, of the nights I stayed up worrying about him, of the life I built so he could have one, but I didn't. Because I saw it then. This wasn't a conversation. It was a decision already made. So I did what I had learned to do my whole life. I stayed calm. I walked to my room. I packed a small bag, clothes, medications, a few personal items, things I could carry without thinking. As I zipped the bag shut, I looked around the room, at the furniture I'd chosen, the photos on the dresser, the years stored in quiet corners. No one followed me. No one stopped me. When I walked back toward the door, she stepped aside to let me pass. Not a word. I stood in the doorway for a moment, holding my bag, looking at the house I had built, the life I had lived inside it. Then I stepped out. The door closed behind me, and with that sound, everything I thought I knew about family changed. What she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I walked out of the house with a small bag in my hand. That was all I could carry. Everything else, my memories, my years of hard work, the life I had built brick by brick, stayed behind, locked inside walls that no longer felt like mine. The street outside was quiet. A few neighbors passed by, smiling or nodding as they always did. I nodded back, mechanically. I didn't feel anything. I couldn't. The weight in my chest was too heavy. My legs felt weak. My mind felt numb. I had nothing left. Not even a voice. All my years of sacrifice, of careful planning, of working to give my son a stable life, it didn't matter anymore. It felt as if they had been erased in a single moment. And the strangest part, my son hadn't stopped it. My son had let it happen. I walked slowly, my bag bouncing against my hip, feeling every inch of my heart break with each step. The world outside the house felt unreal, like I had suddenly been expelled from reality. People moved around me, unaware that a life had just been upended, that a person had been pushed out of the home they had built. I thought about knocking on a neighbor's door. Maybe someone would listen. Maybe someone would see that this wasn't fair. But I didn't. Pride, shame, and disbelief all mingled into one heavy, paralyzing emotion. I kept walking. Where could I go? I had no plan. I had never imagined that I would need one. My home was supposed to be my safe place, the one constant in my life. I had counted on it, relied on it, and now it was gone. I wandered for a while, not really noticing where I was going. The cold wind brushed against my face, but I barely felt it. My thoughts swirled in endless loops. How did it come to this? Why didn't I see it coming? Why didn't I fight harder? Every memory of the house returned in fragments, my son's laughter echoing through the halls, the smell of dinner on quiet evenings, the pictures on the walls capturing years of joy. They weren't just memories. They were proof that I had lived, that I had contributed, that I had mattered. And yet, all of that proof had been rendered meaningless in a single sentence. I thought about calling my son. Maybe he would answer. Maybe he would explain. But every scenario in my mind ended the same way. Silence. Or worse, agreement. That painful agreement that told me he sided with her. That told me I had been replaced in my own family. Eventually, I found myself sitting on a bench in a small park. My bag lay beside me. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to touch it. It felt like the only thing I still owned. Yet even that felt meaningless. Around me, people laughed, jogged, walked dogs, and went about their lives. Life went on outside my misery. The world hadn't stopped for me, and it never would. I thought about where I could sleep that night. I didn't have a friend nearby who could take me in. Hotels were expensive, unfamiliar. The idea of returning home, my own home, was unbearable. And so I sat, trying to gather some shred of composure, some plan, some hope. Tears came slowly at first, then faster. I let them. I had no one to hide from, no one to impress, no one to apologize to. The tears were mine, unfiltered, raw. They reminded me that I was alive, that I had a heart that could feel, that I had loved deeply enough to be hurt this badly. Hours passed. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park. I hugged my bag closer. I didn't want to be noticed. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just wanted to disappear into the cold air and the dimming light. And yet, amidst that despair, a small, quiet thought began to creep into my mind. This isn't over. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the pounding in my chest. But it was there. A whisper. A reminder that while I had been removed from the house, I had not been removed from my own life. That while she had taken the walls, she had not taken my mind, my memory, or my ability to fight back. I thought about all the things I had sacrificed to get to this point. All the patience, all the discipline, all the quiet endurance. None of it had prepared me for this moment. But it also reminded me that I was stronger than I felt. Stronger than the hurt that threatened to crush me. The night grew darker. Streetlights flickered on. I looked at my reflection in the window of a closed shop. A tired, broken woman staring back. But underneath that exhaustion, I saw something else. Resilience. A stubborn, quiet spark that refused to die. I realized that even though I had nothing, I still had myself. That realization, small and fragile, was the first seed of strength I had felt all day. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't stay down forever. I wouldn't. The first step, I decided, was survival. Find shelter. Find food. Regain my footing. And then figure out a way to reclaim what had been taken. It wouldn't be immediate. It wouldn't be easy. And it would require courage I wasn't sure I had. But in that darkness, sitting on a cold park bench, I made a promise to myself. I would not disappear. I would not be erased. And one day, they would realize that removing me from the house didn't remove me from the story. For now, though, all I could do was take one step at a time. I gathered my bag, lifted it onto my shoulder, and walked slowly toward the nearest street that might lead me somewhere safe. Each step was heavy, but with every footfall, the smallest flicker of hope grew inside me. I didn't know what the next day would bring. I didn't know if I would find support, or if I would face further humiliation, or if I would be forced to beg for shelter. But I knew one thing with certainty. I was still here. And as long as I was here, the story wasn't finished. The house may have been taken, the family dynamics upended, and my life temporarily destabilized. But I had survived. And survival, I realized, is always the first step toward reclaiming what's yours. That night, I slept under a thin blanket on a friend's couch, alone, cold and aching, but alive. And for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to believe, however faintly, that the story was not over. That the next chapter might bring justice, truth, or at least closure. Because even when you walk out with nothing, sometimes the nothing is the beginning. The days after I walked out of my own house were long, quiet, and heavy. I kept busy with errands, small tasks, anything to keep my mind from sinking back into the spiral of shame and disbelief. But no matter what I did, that house, the walls, the memories, My life haunted me. Every street corner, every familiar landmark reminded me that I had been forced out. I replayed the confrontation over and over in my mind. Her calm voice, his silence, the finality of it all. And yet, underneath the anger, the sadness, the shock, there was a thought that wouldn't leave me. She doesn't know everything. It started as a whisper, almost absurd, in the quiet of my small apartment. I had thought I knew the rules. I had thought I had no control. I had been wrong. Years ago, when the house was first purchased, I had taken precautions, quiet, unassuming measures that I never thought I would need to enforce. A clause in the paperwork. A small legal safeguard. Nothing dramatic. Something most people would overlook. Something she could never have guessed. I realized now that this was my lifeline, my secret leverage. The one thing that ensured the house could never truly belong to anyone else as long as I was alive and knew my rights. I didn't act immediately. I couldn't. I needed time to think, to plan. I needed to make sure every move I made was deliberate, precise, and undeniable. Impulsive action could backfire, and I had already been weakened enough. I began quietly gathering documents, copies of the deed, statements of payment, legal forms I had signed years ago, but never had reason to enforce. I combed through every file I had stored in my apartment, searching for the thread that would prove my ownership beyond any doubt. And there it was. Not only did I have ownership of the house, but the agreement contained language that gave me final authority over the property in any family dispute. I had known this at some level, but I had never imagined needing to invoke it. Now it was my shield, my sword, my unseen power. I didn't tell anyone, not my son, not her, not even a friend. I kept it to myself. I needed to wait for the right moment, for maximum effect. Timing, I realized, was everything. Then one evening, I received a text from her. Short, sharp, cold. Your son and I are managing the house now. Don't interfere. Her confidence was palpable, and it sent a ripple of anger through me. But not fear. Not anymore. I smiled quietly to myself. She had no idea. She believed she had won completely. She didn't know that her so-called control was built on the illusion that I would stay silent, that I would accept defeat. I called a lawyer the next day. I explained the situation. I laid out the evidence calmly, without emotion. The lawyer was surprised, not because my claim wasn't valid, but because many people would have missed such a simple safeguard in the paperwork. It's airtight, the lawyer said. You have full authority. You can reclaim your house immediately. They cannot legally prevent you from entering or making decisions about it. I let that sink in. The weight that had been crushing me, the helplessness, the despair, lifted slightly. I still felt hurt, still felt betrayed, still felt the sting of being abandoned by my own son in the moment of confrontation. But now I had power, real power, and it was mine to wield wisely. The next step was strategy. I didn't rush. I didn't call them that day. I observed. I let them continue believing they were in control. Every step she took, every decision she made, I watched quietly, knowing it would all unravel when the time was right. I fought about how to approach my son. I needed him on my side, not because of fear, but because he had been silent when he should have spoken. I needed to remind him gently of the truth, the reality of the situation, and the bond we had shared long before she came into our lives. And then, one quiet afternoon, I went back, not to confront, not to fight, but to stand in the doorway, to let her see that I was still here, that I had not disappeared. She opened the door, surprised. Her confident posture faltered for just a fraction of a second. That was all I needed. "I'm here," I said calmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, holding up the folder of documents, "that this house has always been mine, and it remains mine." Her expression shifted. Shock, disbelief, a flicker of panic. I could see her trying to process what I was holding. And in that moment, the illusion she had built, the control, the power, crumbled. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I didn't demand respect. I simply reminded them of the truth, the law, the reality that had existed all along. She sputtered, her words failing her. My son looked between us, finally realizing the magnitude of what had been hidden from him. That silence, the one that had hurt me so deeply before, was gone now. He had been blind, yes, but he could see clearly at last. I took a deep breath. The fear, the uncertainty, the helplessness, they were gone. Not because I had wanted revenge, not because I had needed to prove a point, but because I had remembered who I was, because I had refused to disappear. She didn't know it, but that secret, the safeguard I had quietly maintained, was more than legal power. It was a statement, a reminder that no one can take what is rightfully yours if you are willing to claim it. And that, finally, was the moment the tide began to turn. The next few days felt surreal. She no longer spoke to me the same way. Her confident, casual tone was replaced by cautious politeness. Every word, every movement was measured. She had always prided herself on control, on influence, but suddenly that control was gone, and she knew it. I didn't gloat. I didn't yell. I didn't remind her of the days she had tried to erase me. I simply acted as though I had always been in charge, because legally and morally, I was. The first confrontation happened in the living room, the room she had claimed as hers for months. I walked in carrying nothing but the folder of documents, my presence calm and unshakable. She froze. My son, watching quietly, finally met my eyes. "I think it's time we talk," I said. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She realized instantly that her arguments, her insinuations, her manipulations, all of it, had no weight here. The documents weren't just papers. They were proof of authority, years of legitimate ownership, years of sacrifice, and a lifetime of building a home. My son stepped forward. "Mom," he began. His voice was quiet, tentative, but there was clarity in it now, the kind that had been absent before. I didn't see it before. I thought, he paused, swallowing hard. I thought she was helping. I didn't understand. I nodded slowly. I know, but now you do. She finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't think you'd come back. I didn't know. You underestimated me, I said simply. That was your first mistake. And your second was assuming silence would be my acceptance. Her face turned pale. I could see the panic rising, the realization that the house she had claimed for months was legally and rightfully mine. Every decision she had made, every boundary she had tried to impose, every step she had taken to push me out, undone. I didn't shout. I didn't berate. I let the silence do the work. The weight of truth pressed down on her, and she felt it. My son stepped closer. Mom, I'm sorry, he said. I didn't realize. I should have spoken up. I should have. I put a hand on his shoulder. It's not just your fault. She created an environment where it was easier to stay quiet. But now you understand. That's what matters. The realization in his eyes was profound. He had been blind to manipulation, silent while she rewrote the narrative, but now he could see it. The guilt and regret in his face were undeniable, but it wasn't too late to make things right. She finally spoke again, but this time it was quieter, hesitant. What will happen now? I looked around at the house I had built, the walls that had witnessed decades of life, love, and sacrifice, and I felt a surge of power. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in truth. You will respect that this is my home, I said. You will abide by the agreements and the rules that exist. You are not welcome to make unilateral decisions. And from this point on, the authority is mine. This house, this family, it's not a playground for manipulation. It's a home. And I am in charge of it. Her lips pressed together. Her eyes widened. I could see every plan she had made, every tiny victory she thought she had, unraveling in real time. My son nodded. Mom, I understand. I was wrong before, but I won't let that happen again. I promise. That moment, the acknowledgement, the accountability, was everything. She had counted on control, on fear, on my absence to dominate the situation. She hadn't expected me to fight back calmly, methodically, legally, and morally. That had been her mistake. And now, the tables had turned. I took a deep breath, allowing the moment to settle. I felt the tension drain from my body, replaced by a sense of justice, clarity, and calm satisfaction. I didn't need to shout or make threats. The truth was enough. The documents were enough. My presence, my resolve, my years of patience, and my refusal to be erased, these were enough. She could no longer manipulate the narrative, because I had reclaimed it. And my son, now aware of the truth, was finally seeing the situation clearly. We didn't argue. We didn't fight. The power of certainty and preparation was more effective than confrontation. That's what she hadn't expected. I walked through the house, room by room, letting her see that I had returned not as a guest, not as someone desperate for approval, but as the rightful owner, fully aware of my rights, fully aware of the reality she had tried to rewrite. By the end of the day, she understood that her time controlling the house, the decisions, and even the narrative was over. She had been outmaneuvered, not by anger, not by shouting, but by foresight, calm action, and the simple truth. And I realized something important. The most powerful victories aren't loud. They aren't about revenge. They're about reclaiming what's rightfully yours, standing tall in truth, and allowing the consequences of honesty and legality to fall naturally into place. The house was mine again, not just physically, but spiritually. She had underestimated me. My son had underestimated the situation. But now, the balance was restored. The story was mine to continue writing. And as I stood in the living room that evening, looking around at the familiar walls, the photographs, the memories I had built, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. Not just because I had reclaimed the house, but because I had reclaimed myself. The tables had turned, the lesson had been learned, and the family, though shaken, could finally begin to move forward with honesty, respect, and truth. After the dust settled, life slowly began to feel normal again. But it was a new normal, shaped by lessons learned, truths uncovered, and boundaries finally respected. The house, my house, had been reclaimed, not just physically, but symbolically. Every corner, every photograph, every wall now carried more weight than ever before. They were proof that I had built a life, and that no one could erase it. Not her, not circumstances, not even silence from my own son. She stayed for a few days after the confrontation, careful, subdued, polite, but distant. Her confidence had vanished. The arrogance, the sense of ownership she once carried, as though the house had been hers all along, was gone. She had been forced to see the consequences of her actions. She had underestimated not only the law, but my patience, my resilience, and my determination. Eventually, she left, not angrily, not dramatically, but quietly. With a suitcase and a stiff nod, she couldn't argue. She couldn't fight. The rules had been set. The truth had been laid bare, and she had no choice but to accept them. My son was a different story. That confrontation had been as much for him as for her. He had been silent when he shouldn't have been, passive when he should have acted, and trusting when he should have questioned. Watching him process the truth was both painful and enlightening. I didn't realize. He had said during that first day after the confrontation. His voice had been quiet, tentative, but full of remorse. I didn't understand what was happening. I thought she was helping. I didn't see how much you were giving, how much you were sacrificing. I placed a hand on his shoulder. You couldn't see it then, but you do now. That's what matters. You learned. That's all I ever wanted. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I'm sorry. I should have spoken up. I should have defended you. It's okay. I said softly. What matters is that we move forward from here, together. Rebuilding trust took time, but it happened. He began to participate in decisions around the house, not as the sole authority, but as a partner in mutual respect. He apologized, not just with words, but with actions. He recognized the effort, the patience, and the love that had gone into every brick of the home. Slowly, quietly, we began to rebuild the bond that had been shaken but never truly broken. For the house itself, it felt different now. Not because the walls had changed, or because the furniture had been moved back, but because the energy had shifted. There was a sense of safety, of clarity, of rightful ownership. Every step I took through the rooms reminded me that I had endured, that I had fought with calm and reason, and that I had won, not through anger, but through foresight and resilience. There were lessons learned for everyone. My son learned the importance of observation, courage, and standing up for what is right, even when it feels uncomfortable. The daughter-in-law learned that manipulation and overconfidence cannot override truth and legality. And I learned that patience, clarity, and a deep understanding of my own rights are more powerful than any immediate confrontation or outburst. We even managed to repair our family dynamic. Not perfectly, not instantly, but with honesty, boundaries, and respect. We began to communicate in ways we hadn't before, openly discussing decisions, feelings, and expectations. My home had become a space for dialogue, not dominance, for understanding, not control. The legal safeguards I had put in place years ago were never meant for this confrontation. They had been precautionary, a quiet safety net, but they served their purpose perfectly. They reminded me that planning, foresight, and self-respect are critical, especially when others may try to rewrite the rules of your life. And while the daughter-in-law no longer had control, I did not hold bitterness. I understood her motives: fear, ambition, the desire to assert herself. But her actions had consequences. I had no reason to prolong anger. The lesson had been taught. The authority had been restored. Balance had been achieved. My son and I began creating new memories together. Meals at the table were filled with laughter again, not tension. Conversations were honest, direct, and fair. We celebrated small victories, reinforced boundaries, and strengthened our bond. And in that renewed connection, I found something even more valuable than reclaiming a house. I found peace. The house, in the end, wasn't just a building. It was a testament to years of love, hard work, and sacrifice. It was a place where trust had been tested, where challenges had arisen, and where integrity had ultimately won. Looking back, I realized that being kicked out, walking away with nothing, and feeling powerless had been painful, but it had also been transformative. It taught me patience, resilience, and the quiet strength of knowing your rights. It reminded me that true power is calm, deliberate, and unwavering. The final outcome wasn't just the reclaiming of the house. It was the restoration of dignity, the repair of relationships, and the reaffirmation of boundaries. It was the understanding that no matter what others try to take from you, space, respect, or recognition, truth and perseverance will ultimately prevail. As I sit now in the living room, the sun streaming through the windows, I feel the weight of everything that happened, not as a burden, but as proof of my strength. This house remains mine, not because of fear, not because of force, but because of clarity, patience, and the courage to reclaim what is rightfully yours. The daughter-in-law left, yes, but her departure marked the end of a chapter, not the destruction of a life. My son returned to being present, thoughtful, and aware. And I, standing in my home, finally felt whole again. Sometimes, the hardest lessons come from the people we love the most. But the greatest victories come not from revenge or retaliation, but from reclaiming truth, asserting boundaries, and moving forward with integrity. In the end, the house wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of resilience, of justice, and of the fact that even when life pushes you to your lowest point, you have the power to rise, reclaim, and restore. And now, life moves forward, stronger, clearer, and more grounded than ever before. Looking back on everything that happened, I realize that the story isn't just about a house, a daughter-in-law, or even my son. It's about the choices we make, the boundaries we set, and the courage it takes to stand up for ourselves, even when it feels impossible. Being kicked out of my own home felt like losing everything. And for a moment, it was. I walked away with a small bag, leaving behind the walls, the furniture, and the memories I had created over decades. The world outside felt harsh and indifferent, and I questioned whether I had the strength to reclaim what was mine. But that experience taught me something invaluable. Strength is quiet, patience is powerful, and knowing your rights is essential. I could have reacted with anger. I could have shouted, blamed, or acted impulsively. Many people in my situation might have. But anger alone would not have restored the house, or my dignity, or my sense of self. Calm, deliberate action did. Knowledge of my rights did. Planning did. And most importantly, refusing to disappear, refusing to accept erasure did. I also learned the importance of boundaries. It's easy to let others take control, especially when you love them or want to avoid conflict. But unchecked control allows manipulation to take root. Silence in the wrong hands can be dangerous. I learned that standing firm, speaking up when it matters, and asserting your space, your home, your body, your life, is not selfish. It's necessary. Watching my son realize his mistake and come to understand the truth reminded me that accountability matters. People make errors, sometimes gravely so, but acknowledgement, apology, and effort to repair are what rebuild trust. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, but it restores relationships when paired with understanding and action. The daughter-in-law learned a lesson too. That control, built on manipulation and overconfidence, crumbles when faced with truth. And while I felt a sense of justice, I did not dwell in bitterness or revenge. True victory isn't about making someone suffer. It's about reclaiming your own life with clarity, integrity, and calm confidence. So what's the takeaway for anyone listening to my story? First, always know your rights. Legal safeguards, agreements, and documentation aren't just paperwork. They're protection. They allow you to act decisively when others try to rewrite your life. I had thought the house was just a home. It turned out it was my lifeline. Second, never underestimate the power of patience and observation. Life may knock you down, but impulsive reactions rarely restore balance. Watch carefully, plan your steps, and act with purpose. Timing is everything. Third, trust your instincts. I felt the subtle shifts in my home long before the confrontation. I doubted myself because I wanted to preserve peace. But my gut was right. The warning signs were there. Listening to yourself can prevent small problems from becoming crises. Fourth, boundaries are essential. Giving too much of yourself without protection allows others to claim what's yours. Love and generosity are virtues, but they must coexist with self-respect. A home, like your life, deserves both care and defense. Fifth, resilience is your greatest asset. Being forced out of your home, betrayed by family, and abandoned in your darkest hour could have crushed me. But resilience allowed me to rise. Survival is only the first step. Reclaiming your life, rebuilding trust, and restoring balance, that is the real victory. Finally, the story reminds us that life is full of tests. Some come quietly, creeping in over time. Others arrive suddenly, shattering our expectations. How we respond determines not just the outcome, but who we become in the process. I became stronger because I refused to disappear. I reclaimed my house, not with rage, but with calm certainty. I restored my relationships not with blame, but with truth and boundaries. And in doing so, I found peace, dignity, and clarity. So to anyone who has ever felt powerless, betrayed, or silenced, remember this: you have the strength to reclaim your life, even when everything seems lost. You have the right to stand firm, to protect what is yours, and to rise stronger than before. I want you to take a moment and think. Are there areas in your life where you've allowed others to take control? Are there boundaries you need to reinforce? Are there truths you've been too afraid to assert? Because the moment you decide to act calmly, deliberately, and with knowledge of your worth, the tables can turn. And here's my final message. Life will test you. People will try to push you aside, manipulate you, or rewrite your story. But the difference between being a victim and reclaiming your power is knowing your rights, trusting your instincts, and refusing to disappear. When you walk back into your life with purpose, with calm resolve, and with awareness, you'll find that nothing, no one can take away what is rightfully yours. So stand firm, protect your space, protect your life, and remember, even when it seems like everything is lost, the story isn't over. The ending is still yours to write, because the greatest victories don't come from anger or revenge. They come from resilience, truth, and the courage to reclaim what's yours.